The siblings were allowed to personalize their rooms with whatever they pleased. Nawith liked to raise ants in his room. They were not so needy or difficult to maintain. An old log here, a fern, rocks, a sponge, and a bone, set in a small tank of dirt, and the little creatures had a home. Every so often he would drop a scrap of wet biomass onto the dirt, and within minutes a transmogrifying swarm had surrounded it like a single, writhing entity, no one forager distinguished from the other. They tore the food into chunks and carried it away into their Byzantine home. Nawith occasionally clicked at the tank with his porpoid organ to see the corridors of the hive with sound. He admired the intricacy in the winding tunnels and oval chambers in the dirt. The ants, nearly blind and with 200,000 or so neurons per, made full use of every cubic centimeter of their enclosure. They did not speak. They did not see, and as romantic a thought as it would have been, they were not telepathic. The ants simply knew what to do, where to go. Nawith liked to stare at their movements during his regeneration shift. He listened to the hum of the world as he did so, and if he allowed his heart to slow, his mind to calm, to focus on his auditory sense, he also heard the gentle hum of strings coming from somewhere deep in the heart of the world. When he awoke, those thoughts were a faint memory. He and a million brothers and sisters left their rooms, filed in unison to the dressing rooms, and slipped on their uniforms. He kept his eyes on his own morning procedures. If he looked to his neighbors, he would get lost in a forest of mirrors. One face among thousands of the same cheekbones, thin faces, and dravite yellow eyes. They entered trams or walked to their stations. There was work to be done. No need to hurry, but no reason to tarry. Nawith took a console just as the previous worker left. It was one of thousands, situated at vertices that traced an incomplete geodesic. At its center, something not of this universe, but not impossible, sloped reality forward. Nawith did not understand it, but one need not comprehend a negative energy tensor to maintain its function. He minded the station for a number of rotations until boredom grew noticeable and left it to go to another role. He did not look back. Someone had taken his place within a minute of him leaving. They needed numbers at the reactor bulbs. Something had dwindled the workers there. He arrived, along with 100 replacements, just in time to witness the cause of the accident. A leak had sprung in the plasma piping. Failsafes sprang to work, and under their supervision, the damage was minimized to about 100 deaths. He saw a brother who made it in one piece, but the damage to his body had been significant. Death would come for him. Nawith was needed. He walked past his dying brother to the empty station. Out of the corner of his eye, 2 siblings broke into tears, knelt by their dead, and with solemnity carried the body to a faraway place. Nawith felt pressure against his eyes, a wetness. But there was no role in the world that had need for such a function. Nawith closed and opened his eyes several times. That cleared the sensation. He left that role after a few rotations. There was a newborn when he happened by the fetalaries. Naturally, he thought to train her. He kept his hand firm, but loose around her fingers as he guided her to where he was, first introduced to work, the work that must be done. As the others marched to their stations, he led the newborn down a branching path towards the first job they all had to do. In the first minutes they spent breathing air and not bio-utility fluid the fetalaries nursed to them, they could barely breathe. In his hand, her fingers felt hot, boiling hot. By the time they were halfway there, her protruded belly had receded, and she had gained several centimeters of height. The top of her bald head was now level with his elbow. Nawith left no wake as he walked. The newborn trailed vapor for most of the way. As they walked, she shot glances at the ever-narrowing walls, eyes darting, her grip on his hand tight. Nawith had taken them through one turn to another, from stairs to trams. The corridors kept narrowing. Every so often he would stop and point, telling her what it was they were looking at. "Those are the algexylum tubes," he said, his arm at a 40 or so degree angle up. What they did do? She still shook. Her fine motor neuron clusters had yet to be broken in. They confer coolant, liquid that absorbs heat, usually water. Well, where? To the metamaterial corals. And then he spoke briefly of the phonons. tiny excitations, which were made to course through the superconductive corals, their states ever changing, the change itself a process. That process became memory. He spoke of nanoglass beads which housed high-energy photons, light wave particles, which had the ability to hold those memories ever so briefly. And finally, he mentioned the dense optical cables that ran through the ocean within which the corals grew, ferrying it to the heart of the world. Why? Admittedly, that stumped him. He had never been asked why. He himself hadn't asked it when he was the one standing where she stood. He studied the newborn carefully, upon a sudden aware of how similarly she looked to him. All the siblings looked similar. Identical, actually. The dimorphism was an afterthought, and yet within the hour of her birth she was already unique from him. So he thought of an answer that respected such uniquity. Now with raised a hand, extended his index and tapped her forehead gently. Something similar is happening in there. Little electrical blips, chemicals called neurotransmitters, axons carrying those blips away. To what purpose? This way, and they continued the rest of the way. The trek led to a flight of stairs. The higher they climbed, the more the newborn became distressed. Nawith smiled at this. Her senses were growing nicely. He was once nauseous at the change in the force, keeping his feet to the ground as he climbed those steps. The higher they went, the more the ground seemed to let them go. At his most rebellious, he dared to ask, "Why is there no elevator?" And the answer, quite simply, was, "Were you in a hurry?" So they spent a long time scaling those stairs. Along the way, they met many of Nawith's brothers and sisters. Each had a young sibling with them as well. Nawith looked at his ward, who had now begun to grow a short but dense head of hair. She was getting stronger all the time. Her grip on his hand was loosening. She would be finished by the time they reached the top. There was a hall with many shelves, sporting thousands of black suits with scales and ridges as an outer layer. A package on the back connected the body with tubes and other connections. "What do I do?" she asked. "Choose a name." She thought long and hard. Nirmuta. Nawith lowered his forehead so it touched hers. In the second his eyes took to close, memory became incorporeal, skin became channel. His first few years of service flowed into her. Her muscles jittered as new nerves grew explosively, absorbing the memory as though Nirmuta had done this job all her life. It was experience cultivated over lifetimes, polished and perfected. Nirmuta left without another word, donned a free suit like a second skin, and joined the gathering at the far end of the hall. There, thousands of newborns stood, on the edge of openings in the floor below which laid open ocean. Thin, white wisps floated over the concave surface of the water. When she first woke with her brother's face bearing over her, she felt the most intense love and longing to follow him. Now, with the suit over her skin, she did not look back. She would likely never see him again. And when a light in the ceiling glowed green, she and thousands of her brothers and sisters jumped. When Nawith first saw his newborn sister, he felt nothing but the most intense love and need to guide her. When he had finished conferring his knowledge, his thoughts returned. He stood back and shook his head. Then Nawith walked away. He would never think of her again. The job, however, he sometimes returned to in memory. Scraping capacitance barnacles off the corals, replacing the old metamaterial wafers that made up most of its mass. They were small enough to work in the crannies between the wafers. They would work there until they grew too large. At regeneration time, he would sleep in those warm waters. There he had dreamt. Even then he had heard that melody. The sweet humming, the sound that had a life of its own. He never learned to think about himself, to spectate his own life, until those notes first met his ears. He became more than his tasks while listening to it, and when he outgrew the corals, a sibling commented on his expression, asking, "Are you unwell?" And Nawith could only reply that he felt fine, but something felt missing when he stepped out of that ocean, a comfort that he had heard so very clearly while in water. Once a rotation, they meditated in a bright room usually situated close to a workstation where their skin could metabolize the light into food. He had tried before to sway the topic of conversation to the sound. It was then he learned the dismay of uniquity. His role now was in many ways simpler than tending to the corals. The world had an immense host of machines that all needed some attention once every so often. For some rotations, he tended to the carapace at the edge of the world to make sure it was growing a healthy enough protective layer of ice. If not, he possessed membranes that could feel any excess radiation leaking through. He was familiar with the biomass cristae, those unanchored parts of the world where its workers had to wear propulsion suits to float from place to place. The viscous slurry produced there would feed the oceans, the greenhouses, and the fetillaries. He spent the most rotations maintaining the conduit bronchi, whose breath brought electricity to their entire world. The siblings were to make sure the field generators kept a tight hold on the rivers of metallic hydrogen in the piping. He met someone named May while working there. May was much older than him, but Nawith recognized him well enough even behind the wrinkles and slightly drooped eyes. It was a little unnerving to see one's own future in a way, but fascinating nonetheless. May had led the work on maintaining the conduits in that sector for countless rotations. "Watch that port in the tube," May said during their break. Nawith looked up. Far, far up in the ceiling, above the immense conduit bundles, was a single algexilum. There was one transparent port in it. Blue water flowed through it silently, then went dark. He squinted his eyes. Something had shadowed against the port. Movement. Mass. It blinked. He blinked, then scrambled back in shock. He peered again, but the water had returned to normal. "What was that?" Nawith asked. May smiled deeply at his response. He waved out at the brothers and sisters making their rounds on the conduits. "They're too young to care. But you're curious. That was a supervisor." "I thought you were a supervisor. We all need to be supervised." May grunted as his muscles tensed. His bones took on the weight of his body, and he heaved himself back on his feet. Back to work. During the light bathing, the others sometimes talked about May, saying that he had spent many rotations in every corner of the world doing every kind of role. During all that time traveling, it was said that May became strange. Nawith didn't think he was strange. He approached him about it one rotation during the break. May laughed, surprising Nawith. "Sorry," the older sibling said. "It just makes too much sense." "What do you mean?" "I met someone once, the same way you met me, and everyone around me thought her strange. But I felt anger at that. She said to me, 'We are all the same.'" He laughed again. The unfamiliar sound made Nawith wince, yet alleviated his mood at the same time. "We are all the same," Nawith repeated. Its meaning was inscrutable to him. "I've been all over the world. Just keep to yourself. Do your work and you will be happy, strange or not." Nawith did not understand what May meant, but the break was over, and so they returned to work. May died that rotation. They had shut down a conduit for maintenance. A runaway jolt had failed to be drawn away during the grounding process. Nawith had screamed. The flash was so bright, like a pillar of light many people wide at the base, quadrillions of volts, a fraction of a second. Then it was safe again. But there before the pipe, several scorch marks had indented into the floor. Machines emerged from the hidden places to clean it up. Nawith worked with his siblings to repair the damage and connect the conduit. With a heavy hum, the energy began flowing properly again. It was a small mistake. They fixed it. Overall, the delay was less than an hour. This was the way it had always worked. Yet this time was different. A brother walked up to him as they stood back to watch the machines prepare to leave now that the repair was finished. "I'm sorry," he said. "We knew you two were closer." "Why?" It was obvious. But Nawith was looking elsewhere. Everywhere. Their surroundings. The pipes that stood 100 siblings tall, suspended on scaffolding that allowed them to be stacked all the way to the ceiling. His eyes moved to the port in the algexilum. Nothing was watching them when several of his siblings died. Nawith stewed in emotion he didn't know he had. Why? A new supervisor naturally rose into position. It wasn't always the eldest among them, and no vote was needed. The right sibling for the role assumed it within the hour. Operations resumed as normal. For Nawith, it had been a good 30 rotations since he woke, a taxing work period. He felt heavy, not just from labor. He returned to his housing complex for regeneration. Along the way, he remembered something. Built adjacent to their living spaces were the pools and the greenhouses. Long stalks of bulbous kelp grew in the water, should his siblings feel the occasional pang of hunger for solid food. Dark greens flourished vigorously in the greenhouses under the permanent lighting. It was here he had found his tiny friends. He walked past the flora and into the water. He broke off a sizable chunk of the kelp to bring back to his room. He broke off a piece to give to the ants. They took to it enthusiastically. He smiled, feeling better, but he could not regenerate. When he closed his eyes, his thoughts haunted him. Why? When May passed, he felt torn. It was the right thing to feel, but he had not felt it when he saw other siblings pass. He wanted to regenerate. He thrashed about in his bed. His breaths were short. His thoughts addled. After a feverish rotation, he woke sprawled on the floor of his room with his forehead slick with sweat. Trembling, he pulled himself back on his feet. He clicked at the tank to feel the sonar wave return with the maze-like map of the ant colony. It calmed him to see order, stability, every chamber built with a purpose, every colony member in its place. The ants were never confused. They were never lost. Naewith opened the top of the tank and reached inside. With an unsteady finger, he pressed the whirl of his index onto an ant, pushing it into the earth. It was dead instantly. Noises, footsteps, rustled outside his door. The siblings in his housing complex were preparing for work. Naewith stayed utterly focused on his pets. At first, the ants didn't care. It took so long for them to notice. Naewith almost despaired, but eventually they caught the sign of death. 2 ants branched away from their usual work to peel their sister off the earth and haul her away. The procession of the hive was unperturbed. Naewith had never felt more apart from his world. He returned to his comfort place in his mind, those waters where the corals exchanged heat, where he had first heard the beautiful humming and learned to see himself. Now he couldn't stop seeing his surroundings, those endless leagues and fathoms of pipes, machines, tanks, and conduits. He remembered every accident he had ever encountered, every sibling he had seen consumed by runaway energies, every time he did not care. He had never once asked what they were all doing, and why. It took their lives to do every rotation. At first he cried. Then he laughed, the same sound May made, but somehow he doubted it was from the same emotion. He left his room, changed, but did not assume a station. It hurt him to do so. Every subconscious urge in his head pulled him towards a role. Any role. He refused to work. The pulls became screams. He walked through the corridors of the world, neither idling nor working, clutching the sides of his head. Passing siblings gave him a wary glance, nothing more. Eventually, the final poignant motivator was employed. Pain. It was like fire at a pinpoint, pressed on every nerve in his body. He'd rather face it than to suffer a fate like May. To work for something he did not understand, then forgotten when he expired. Naewith collapsed onto the cold floor in one of uncountable corridors. He couldn't move, though his senses still worked. He heard 2 siblings approach, one fully grown, the other still squat, ungainly, and hot with mitosis. They passed him within an inch of his hands. He felt the heat of the newborn for a split second. Then the cold returned. Another pair approached. They passed as well. Naewith did not know how much time passed before he felt arms lifting him off the ground. He had enough strength to turn his neck and became lost in the faces of his siblings. He was the one being carried along, limp and useless. Then he was the sibling on the left and on the right, carrying a distressed brother where he needed to go. Naewith didn't know who he was anymore. They took paths he never knew existed, down corridors he had never been, deeper into the machine host. His siblings' thoughts were his as well. They had not known the way here either. It was when their eyes fell upon him sprawled there on the floor that knowledge exploded in their minds, and they remembered what must be done. And only 2 of them remembered, for only 2 was needed for this ritual. They carried him to a chamber where the corpses were disposed of. Nawith remembered at the same time his siblings remembered. He realized why. When their hands touched his, skin to hoist him along, they were taking his knowledge, his experiences. The connection was two-way. He felt what they felt, the immense weight of a death in the family, the same wretched feeling he harbored for May's death. They arrived at the disposal chute. The ritual was almost done. The sibling named Lashe laid Nawith's limp form down, kissed his cheek, and met their foreheads together. Nawith felt his brother's most joyful memories settle gently in his own life. He remembered what he had never done. That time he swam to the farthest ends of the Coral Ocean and saw a looking glass in the Algexilum, a port where he met something staring back. He raised a hand and pressed against the glass, and so did the stranger within the tube. They shared thoughts, conversed, and became friends for the years it took for him to grow too large to work in the coral oceans. The second sibling, named Namora, gave him a time when she laid on the beach within the greenhouses next to a sister during regeneration. They came together, fingers to skin, palms joining palms, relishing each other's touch in ways that had been forgotten for eons. The capacity for such sensation remained in the flesh, untapped, serving no purpose in any role in their world. Nawith had not known such intimacy existed. Then, with the most care possible, Nawith was allowed to fall into the chute. Rushing waters took him away. The waters were as warm as him. The tube was dark. Time seemed to blend from second to minute and minute to hour. His senses became so dull, Nawith thought his body had eroded away. In that womb-like darkness, Nawith finally fell asleep. He woke to deepening music. Something had grabbed him, dragging him through the tube towards the sound he had been hearing all his life. The creature that held him was powerful. He would not be able to fight it. "Friend," he said out loud. The creature was a finned mantle. Its back, or perhaps its front, was alive with flexible appendages that had grasped onto him. Through that touch, he was kindly gifted knowledge as to where they were going. The creature was taking him to the very heart of the world. It was pure ocean there. Kilometers wide and longer still, perfectly ovoid, and freezing cold. The creature, which he now knew as a squid, wrapped its tentacles around him, forming a warm, airtight seal. The texture became transparent so he could see. Together, they swam deeper. Nawith passed schools of shrimp as large as him. They were workers of their own roles as well. They tended to the kelp farms with their complex claws. Luminescent vegetation drifted in the currents. Many more of the squid darted about. They served as attendants. This ocean had a master. His squid had brought him to the world's ruler. He could finally ask his questions. Half buried under a forest of optical cables in front of him was a pyramidal form with dense gray skin riddled with protruding cilia. Rows of eyes opened. Each had two lids, whites, and a yellowish iris. Its body was well over a kilometer long. The closer Nawith came to it, the warmer the waters, and the more voluminous its somber humming became. At its base, 1,000 appendages sprouted outward, each sheathed by control mechanisms, which gave it command over the world. Nawith realized then, this wasn't a world at all. "What are you?" he asked. The humming stopped. For the first time in his life, Nawith knew silence. "We are brothers, far, far apart. But you are no less important than I. We are all necessary." Nawith remembered, as if the knowledge was in him the entire time and never relevant until this moment. A single taxonomic term, Homo sapiens siphonophore, a necessary leap in an epoch's-old evolutionary history. Before him was the greatest sibling, they whose thoughts boiled oceans, they whose wisdom was bottomless and unknowable. Only the greatest sibling comprehended the ship's functions, piloting it all this time, running away from the enemy. "You made us," Nawith said. "For what reason do our siblings die by the hundreds? This ship cannot run without your work, and it has no direction without me. We are all needed. We are all a part of the ship. You have purpose. You all have meaning. Every single one of you, no less material than the other. Why did you bring me here? Do you wish to continue working or to rest forever? We can afford this kindness. We can make you capable of swimming in these waters and be closer to our home. Now with thought long and hard. Then he answered. He learned quickly how to use this stronger, versatile body. With it, his mind expanded throughout his large mantle, and he understood the purpose in every machine and every station. Among his new, more difficult duties, he had time to travel through the many channels in his world. From there, he watched his siblings perform their roles. Very rarely some noticed him. Even fewer came close enough for him to feel their thoughts. He relished those moments, and they seemed in awe of him, knowing deep inside they had nothing to fear. Often he felt sadness for his siblings as he watched them move so steadily from role to role, sometimes laughing, sometimes succumbing, but mostly mute. But he was patient. There must be others who heard the song. Until then he swam, just as his world did through what he now understood as an infinite ocean, running. He didn't care why or from what, because no matter where they swam, he knew he was already home. Enjoy another amazing story. You know, on Earth, rabbits don't do that. The captain had been told the stellar flare's current mission would involve a recently contacted species out in the Paradise Belt. It was the most inhabited part of the galaxy in terms of sheer volume of life forms and life-bearing worlds. But when it actually produced sapience, it tended to get a little intense. On record, it was estimated hundreds of burgeoning civilizations had had their lifespans cut short by rapidly over-evolving wildlife, disease, and any number of over-violent planetary cycles. Sometimes I wish I didn't work for this branch, Captain. Phil Sky thought as he watched a video clip showcasing the local civilization of interest's lifestyle unfold. It was marked, ominously and unofficially, as Blade Rabbit Daily Take 7. Apparently, the last 6 drones had been forced to retreat due to unexpected extreme hazards. The recording showed a group of lagomorphic bipeds, each a little shorter than a human, jumping startlingly high up at a large life form. The object of their hunt was something that had been only half-jokingly dubbed a murder hopper by the Interplanetary Interspecies Cooperative of the Near Ring Federation's flora and fauna researchers. It looked like the sapient lagomorphs, they'd called themselves Latansi, bigger, more dinosaur-adjacent cousin. It had evolved some sort of half-armor, but it wasn't good enough. It was cornered, cowed, and stabbed repeatedly as the Latansi hit their mark with vicious semi-efficiency. Any of them that missed simply fell to the ground, unbothered, maybe rolled a bit head over heel before laughing and getting back up. Phil watched one get stuck, struggling to pull its very sharp-looking retractable horns from where they'd gotten lodged in the ground. It would have been cute if it didn't share a frame with its fellows disemboweling and bleeding the giant fauna sample to death, the great thing crashing with an unceremonious thud into the dirt with enough impact to shake some of the Latansi off their feet. They seemed to be having a great time. Phil's head was, very often, hazy. It got hard to focus, his mind wanting to be in a very far-away, special place just for him. This particular spectacle was wild enough to keep him grounded. He was sitting in an adjustable chair in the bowl-like floor rim pattern that made up the walkable area of the stellar flare's bridge. With a few button presses or the right tool, the whole flooring would remake itself to the whims and plans of whoever currently needed access to the variety of readouts, monitors, and system access devices that kept the stellar flare aware and responsive. Phil was talking to the ship's core, which was currently taking the form of a sphere jutting from a port leading to the ship's complex underbelly. They seemed to have survived into the spacefaring age by evolving rapid maturation in all aspects: neurological, physiological, psionic. Stel, the fully intelligent core and heart of the ship, summarized. They reached teenage equivalency in less than 2 years, full adulthood in 4, and seemed to not really have a concept of, or regard, for childhood beyond having a word for their infancy, defining it as the stage in life of needing protection from threats. I'm going to assume there's a very large catch. Phil Sky's mind threatened to blur, fade away, as the conversation only just began. He blinked a few times, forced himself to write. No daydreaming. He was well aware his ship had been intentionally fitted with a pre-awakened core because they didn't trust his captaining. Nepotism, they whispered as he went by. Phil had to prove he at least could stay attentive while being babied. Have you ever dealt with people younger than you and thought, I wish they were less grating and stupid? Worried over them getting hurt, emotionally or otherwise, with their rashness and lack of experience? Stell paused for emphasis, that mainly aesthetic sphere of hers. It wasn't even close to her real body, glowing with pink warmth. Imagine an entire species that's in that state for the majority of its life, except it knows how to shoot a gun almost by the time it can walk. So they mature in the flesh faster than the mind, is what you're saying? Not quite. They reach adult equivalency brain development in full by that 4th year. The problem is they don't get world experience, just heavy schooling that seems to last most of their lives. Elders rule, while among the young to middle adult populace, they have... Stell paused again for emphasis, as she referenced some nugget of information that took her less than a fraction of a second to pull up. A 75% mortality rate. Okay, how does it get worse? Phil knew this back and forth. Stell seemed to relish in dramatization, coddling, and closeness with her crew, like a young mother who was far too eager to make her children, and everyone else believed she was more than capable of handling her charges, thank you, or a grandmother trying to hold on to her riper years. Phil knew she was actually older than her position would suggest, recycled almost a dozen or so times. Half of that is from murder, or the practically suicidal pursuit of achievement. Given your task is to participate in a hunt that merits glory in its victory, I imagine this will become an obstacle. Stell hesitated. Phil could tell the difference by that slight, unnecessary tilt of her sphere shell. I understand they want human crew down there since they can endure the storm, but do you really have to... She trailed off purposefully. I'm dampened enough already. I can barely use the equipment of this ship without help, and I'm shit for strategizing and diplomacy. Technically not true, Phil had been raised blue blood. Might as well get my ass down somewhere useful. He smiled thinly. He could see the headline already. Playing banner to the bottom corner of a screen on some small backwater world's newscast, the only place that'd care for such individual gossip. Ill-suited captain to IIC vessel causes diplomatic incident, impaled by space rabbits. Phil had never actually seen a rabbit, only pseudo-equivalents. He wasn't Earth wealth, just colony descendant. He guessed this was close enough. The more Phil stared at the female, logomorphic alien in front of him, the more it became clear it probably wasn't anywhere close to an accurate representation of the experience of seeing a true oryctolagus cuniculus in person. For starters, it was hard to get past those razor-sharp sword-like protrusions coming from her skull, though right now they hung like the world's most concerning earrings around. Her jaws in resting mode. The rest of her slightly shorter form was enclosed in some kind of hazard wrap, glittering as the planet's yellow-green light caught in a sickly but oddly enticing way on her protective layers. It was like the universe wanted to convince Phil she was a rare treasure, not a comically dangerous herbivore from a planet that was carefully crafted to demonstrate that some plant eaters are really adept at helping you find out when you screw around with them. Her face was rough, with 2 large eyes and protruding incisors that gave her a half-lisp she actively tried to hide as she spoke. She'd clearly practiced some of the trade tongues thoroughly, not bothering with a translator. I apologize. If any of my kin have been giving your kinds trouble, they are not as established as I, she tutted, guiding Phil away from the stellar flare's highly adjustable, built for utter accommodation comforts into a planet that was typically Paradise Belt. As the landing ramp got further and further away, Phil got more and more aware. He was still young and had much to live for. Our ship is hardy, she can take it. Unlike my frail human bones, but that's what quick thinking is for. Phil wished he didn't lack it half the time. Even now the world faintly blurred. He was only just attuned enough to the psi-empathic world to barely cross the threshold. Margin for being able to use relevant tools, but he'd foregone his mental adapter device anyway. He felt positive emotions filter around him, sometimes tickling at his consciousness before fading away. I'm told your kind is not made for these sorts of environments, that your planet is bereft. The alien seemed proud of her word choice, tutting more pleasantly. I can't possibly imagine how strange that must be for you and all the others in your great space council. She made a face, pulling up her lower lip in a grimace. Phil saw teeth far sharper than you'd expect on an herbivore. Phil passed by a plant that looked like it could endure a nuclear apocalypse. I wasn't born on Earth. If you're wondering if I'll suddenly die from exposure to your world's specialities, don't worry. Learning not to do that is in my job training. Phil tried to smile but couldn't keep it up. He was walking through a landscape made of the same sickly yellow greens he'd seen from the sky, filled with plants that were much rougher than they were pretty, jagged and rugged stones, some of great size, and grass that was so tall and thickly tangled he couldn't see anything off the designated path they moved across. He thought he heard something snap in the distance, followed by the cry of some local animal. It was a dying noise, punctuated by the mechanical groaning of primitive, but more than workable roaming machines. If Phil looked up, craned his neck hard, he could catch the glint of metal somewhere in that grassy sea. What are those? He vaguely gestured in the direction he'd heard the sounds. Harvest walkers. They gather things for us and kill undesirable wildlife, the lagomorph explained. She tilted her head, shoulders rigid for a moment before she relaxed them. She seemed to think Phil might find that distasteful. Phil opened his mouth to say something, but his inner calm rang him first. It was Stell. You're approaching the ruin site. If you want to back out, now's the time. Otherwise, good luck. He emerged from the high grass into an open plain. Mountains framed it, conveying a presence of predatory looming, with twists and snags highlighted by great covers of some local flora, the blankets of plant matter sitting lazily draped across, the peaks and hills at random but impressively discernible intervals. The region was a half-moon bowl, like the mountain range was trying to cup the open space gently but jealously, a precious thing to guard closely against the threat of unchecked flourishment that was the grasslands. Phil got to see the harvest, walkers in full now, carrying the bodies of creatures great and small, slinking and slothful, in great semi-transparent bins on their backs and dangling from the sides of the tall mobile platforms. Many of the towering vehicles carried bushels of local flora, too, in a bright arrangement of colors that were more carefully secured than the culled wildlife in sturdier-looking containers and well-hung nets. Lotansi of various builds, some of them actually a little taller than Phil, leaned against the outer walls and railings of the great machines, many of them with their arms folded over the ladder or sitting with their legs kicking on boxes. Some had stalks of a local plant in their mouths. A few, as Phil watched, curled them into flute shapes with their hands and blew sound through them. This whole scene gathered around a tall, looping, tower-like structure sat in the middle of the plain, made of old stone. It was, possibly, thousands of years old, tens of thousands even. It was sacred and historically important enough the local dominant sapients had only made a few sparse introductions to the surrounding environment, in the form of an old castle with strange embellishments, and a couple more modern research centers. The Latanzi had graciously allowed the bevy of aliens that had suddenly contacted their planet to build one themselves. So you want me to climb that? Phil pointed, getting to the brunt of the issue. The tower swirled with yellow-green energies. It was a thought storm, burning bright but not so bright it couldn't be handled by local efforts. Phil could see the grass growing taller at the tower's feet, twisting, tangling, snarling like an unstoppable cancer, which was accurate, as it was effectively just that. It giggled and screamed with joy, having picked up wayward happy thoughts and sounds from the Lotanzi by now. There were animal cries Phil couldn't discern in that off-putting song, too. Yes, we understand that humans enjoy this sort of thing. The female Lotanzi made a tutting, mirthful sound, hopping twice in place, one foot pushing against the ground then the other, clearing a meter off the floor easily both times. The IIC didn't really do big events. It was an organization dedicated to supporting the people saving the world, or making sweeping changes to corrupt systems, or fixing ecosystems and rebuilding entire settlements. Sometimes it basically did that on its own, depending on the scale. This was a diplomatic mission more or less on the small side to build trust and help establish trade and diplomacy. Apparently someone had mentioned an old Earth holiday, Easter, in the presence of the Lotanzi at some point during some Conversation or meeting. The Lotanzi had promptly cross-referenced some other traditions and behaviors displayed by the NRF and IIC's many alien members, coming to the conclusion that the outsiders would very much love to participate in a local festivity of their own. Stell pinged Phil over the comlink. If you're wondering what the mortality rate is for this particular festival, it's not as high as it could be. We'll intervene if need be. Great. If this wasn't a matter of getting trust from his crew, in the first place, Phil would turn around and send someone else after hearing that. There's supposed to be a reward for those egg hunts, isn't there? He muttered under his breath. The Lotanzi standing right next to him propped up an ear, pointedly, and showed her teeth. It was probably supposed to be a companionable gesture, but all Phil saw was rows of needles fronted by two bigger ones. He reminded himself these were herbivores. Sometimes we show off in these events to court, make bets on winners. The Lagmaroff made a vague gesture with one ear and her hips. Phil didn't know what that meant. Nonchalance? Humor? Right. His brand of blue blood heritage had been mercantile and diplomatic, but he found that he got stuck dealing with enough brain fog and strangeness to clip his tongue more often than not. Maybe they were right about me. The female Lotanzi pointed at some sort of squat mechanized platform. We've decided to let you borrow a climber for this. Think of it like a small, more grippy harvester. Unless I've been told wrong, you can't hop! She looked up at Phil, head slightly cocked, measuring him. Her eyes glinted as they reflected light. Phil wasn't here to win this event. Not really. He was basically here to help prove the NRF had good intentions, and the IIC too. He was human, psionically dampened, and thus effectively resistant to that crazy storm's more direct mental negative effects. Some Lotanzi scientists would be taking notes, observing him from on top of those tall machines. He looked at the tower again. Somewhere inside that structure was some kind of prize. He'd be competing to get to it first, on paper, but he really just planned on going through the motions and helping out any locals who got hurt. The little hopper climber machine waited for him, a metal basket with a multi-latched, lockable lid in front of it between two metal arms. Phil realized something. Either he'd never asked what he was supposed to be looking for in there, or he'd forgotten. This might be embarrassing. Nobody had died yet, but it was becoming clearer by the second Stell hadn't been kidding about that mortality rate. All around Phil, the Lotanzi rushed and laughed and screamed. Their powerful leg muscles kept them in the air half the time, going from loop to loop, like the world's most jubilant missiles soaring past him. A lot of them carried blatantly hazardous firearms and tools. Others bounced carrying picks and just kind of assumed they'd cleanly slap into the targeted wall, doing a butt wiggle and following it with a running jump. Phil watched one fall and his heart stopped. He started messing with controls, not sure if he could move down with the climber machine's frontal basket to catch them in time. He paused. The Lotanzi bounced off a conveniently placed mushroom into a well-placed net. It gave a reassuring ear tilt to another one that leaped down to check on it. Right. They're immature, not stupid. Phil hoped he wouldn't find out the limits to that difference anytime soon. Some of the Lotanzi climbed solo, some in groups, but you could roll a dice to see how much they'd bothered to protect themselves. None of them forwent the hazard rap, but Phil could see some just hopping around solo and gearless, almost slipping and falling every time they tested a crumbling embellishment in the architecture or an unstable platform. The older ones carried themselves a lot better, blatantly idling near the youths with safety gear and bundles. Phil felt like he was in the middle of a great migration, surrounded by machines big and small. He wagered there was some kind of size limit on those, since he only saw ones big enough to hold about 4 Lotanzi if they weren't just harvesters. The harvesters only seemed to be interested in the flora and the flying and skittering creatures, running all over the tower, panicking or curious with the sudden arrival of hundreds of people. Stell? Anything I need to be on the lookout for? She answered over the earpiece. You're looking for an egg, I believe. Eggs, rather. I'd tell you what's in them, but apparently that is a surprise. Nasty surprises? Anything. From a free pet to land deeds, going by some Q&As with the locals and shared records. Phil observed his surroundings again, now on the lookout for prizes. He might as well try to participate enough he wouldn't give any offense. He wasn't a bumbling tourist. Herds of puffy-headed plants scattered spores like magic dust as they went all throughout the inner and outer loops of the tower, disturbed by all the movement. Phil watched some of them go by briefly, wondering if this event was part of their life cycle somehow. A Latanzi burst through the dainty floating plant's head, winking as it went by, then sneezing when it landed a loop branch away. It was covered in snowy plant fluff. Phil decided to try to follow it. He grunted and winced. The climber machine itself was halfway to being a death trap. It was built for someone smaller than him, the cup seat digging into his back. When the springs sprang and the clunker went soaring, he hit his head on its roof. He had to crane his neck on the next landing, turn the machine a little to see where the puff-bombed Latanzi was going. He went after it, into a twisting ring-like tunnel. Are we even supposed to go down these side paths? He had a moment of strong doubt, not sure if his memory was dying on him again, tossing out details he desperately needed. The world seemed to grow narrow. The tunnel was just wide enough to let him move the machine freely through it, though it teased his balance, the floor uneven and swirling like a funhouse obstacle. Phil had an inkling he should go back, but that same sense of trepidation told him he'd be leaving someone to harm if he just turned around. So he kept going. Stell? Something doesn't feel right. Investigating, keep in touch. Get whoever you feel is appropriate on standby. What's the cause for the sense of urgency? Not that I doubt you, but it seems sudden. I'm not sure. No, there was a reason, besides the sudden change in environment. His head tingled. In that way it did when his eyes and mind wanted to wander in tandem. He'd never been spacey. No. He'd only gotten like that after his awakening training had botched. There was always something at the edges of his perception, his thoughts, his consciousness. His mind reached for something that wasn't there anymore. He suddenly found himself wanting his mental adapter back. His mouth dried, throat parched. He came back to the present in a field of grass he'd already gone through, tall and bowing. Around him, as if to greet him. Metal glinted in the distance in patches, like shining eyes peeking through the plants. They felt less like a curiosity this time, more hungry. The grass was bright yellow now, no green tint to any of it. Were those black stripes? Stell? Am I still inside the tower structure? The response was delayed, but only briefly. Yes. Why are you wandering the same crawl space? Your vehicle can barely fit through. I'd advise a retreat. I think something's probing my consciousness. Will you guide me back? Stell was silent again, for too long. Long enough Phil wondered if the thing digging into his head was getting further in. He emerged outside of the grass after a few turns, the before retreating like a wave on a beach to reveal the now. The tunnel came back, and he emerged onto one of the balcony-like platforms that littered the inside of the tower. The event was still going on. There was an egg in front of him, nudged up against a railing that had long crumbled away, precariously and ready to fall with the slightest disturbance. Phil picked it up with the climber machine's extra arms, pulled it up and tossed it into the basket, with just enough gripping force to make Phil surprised it didn't explode in the thing's claws. The egg was more a spherical webbing, like someone had reinforced one of the nets that the Latanzi used on the walkers, molded it into a bag and called it a day. Can we open these as we get them? I wouldn't advise it. You're just losing time. Stell let concern into her voice. We should contact the diplomat who'd greeted you. Do you want someone to deliver your adapter to you? Philly peered around. He was about to say yes. Then he realized he never found the Latanzi. He saw the diplomat, making that gesture she'd made earlier, moving one ear and her hip, standing on a balcony. It made sense for her to be there. Phil felt wanted, suddenly, and glad for it. He felt attracted, drawn in, like a planet trapped in a greater star's orbit, helplessly gravitating towards her and almost slipping and falling a long way down, as he misjudged the machine's footing. When he reached her, he saw she was real, and was hit with the sensation he shouldn't have doubted that for a second. Are you enjoying the game, Captain? We've only had a few injuries so far. The Latanzi smiled, looking up at him. I see you found something already. You're going pretty slowly, though. Everyone else already has at least 3. I think something's off. Someone's missing, and I encountered a hallucinatory psi hazard. I don't care, we'll keep playing. I feel young again. Young, not. The diplomat began to hop in place like before, but she didn't go up too high. It was hard to tell if it was a nervous or excited motion. I hear your species doesn't get going for a while, or the other ones that came with you. Most of them, anyway. You're slow. I can't ever imagine having to live a life where I'm dumb and plodding for most of it. Then just when things get good, I start to rot. Phil really should have brought his adapter. He couldn't use the telepathic function of his comm. He had a feeling it didn't matter, though, so he just whispered, dread pooling in his chest. He flexed his fingers, ready to move. Stell. Got an empathic hazard somewhere in here. Might be stronger than hazard gear. Get the science and wildlife crew on standby. Call a hazard squad, rapid response if you can get them to answer. There was a tear in her suit. Something yellow-black, like bumblebee moss or police tape, covered it halfway. When Phil looked at it, it sensed him, digging into her flesh through the opening like it had always belonged. She didn't even flinch. I've always dreamed of seeing aliens. We always knew they were out there, the stars pulling us by the hand, wanting to show us new friends and places, but we just couldn't get high enough off the ground. The Latansi diplomat turned towards Phil, cocked her head. How high can you jump? The world tried to go hazy, distorted, but Phil didn't let it. He moved. He treated the diplomat the same as the egg he'd picked up. He threw her into the basket, pulled her in, then let the lid slide back over and lock her in. He expected some kind of struggle, but she just started laughing. He started bounding down. The tower. The platforms, loops, alcoves crumbled as he slammed or thudded onto and into them, hitting all the wrong places at the worst times. His vehicle didn't even have proper windows, just a back and some half-assed rails. Someone started shooting at him, and he was pretty sure those were for surprise wildlife encounters, not human hunting. He heard laughter behind him and dared to peek back. He saw Lotanzi bursting through those flying puffy plants again, coming, out all covered in white powder like they'd been playing in the snow. Phil thought of it as war paint. Everything suddenly became too loud and too fast, blurring around him. Hazard team is en route. You're in luck. We had legionary envoys nearby. Stell sounded calm, but it wasn't clear how real that was. The harvesters kept harvesting, climbing like fat insects and snuffling boars as they searched for treasure in a giant tree. Some of them were empty now, going autopilot. Out of the corner of his eye, as everything whipped and flashed by, Phil could see some of the elders wrangling younglings, or even some of the younger Latanzi just carrying on like nothing was wrong. That only made him more paranoid. He lost focus, breathing hard. One jumped onto the roof of his vehicle. Phil heard the telltale thud screech of climbing picks embedding themselves into metal. A Latanzi dipped their head over the rim. It was the same one from before as far as Phil could tell. It smiled and slurred butchered trade speech. "I never seen human before. Sorry about this. You grabbed the best egg. I was looking for that." It pointed at the basket as if Phil couldn't possibly know what it meant otherwise. Its blade horns went from hang down to pointed up. It tilted its head at the right angle to stab Phil through the eyes. "I die a legend," it giggled, too madly. There was a clear break in its hazard wrap. Phil thought he saw tears running down its face. He couldn't even tell why. He punched it in the face, paused his vehicle just for a second. He smarted and hit his head so hard on the roof he thought he'd get a concussion and blackout. More Latanzi giggled past him, thudding into nets or bouncing off of mushrooms. One landed with a pick, then pulled out something strikingly similar to a flamethrower. It laughed and confirmed the tool's purpose with a jet of fire that incinerated a puff plant passing by. Phil grabbed the one off his roof as it started to tumble down, angled to fall to a harder, more splattery fate against a hard stone and a patch between safety nets below. The arm basket was big, but he didn't want to put two mind-altered Latanzi in the same tight space. He held on to this one while it sat dazed and giggling. Okay. Plan. Phil saw more of those web eggs propped against or inside of angles, protrusions, holes. He started grabbing them like a shopper with a grudge in a major sale. His hunch worked. The Lufthansa trailing after them started yelling and shouting, which only intensified when he started throwing all those precious prizes into random safety nets, open harvester baskets and sling nets, at random bounce fungi. The Lufthansa began to disperse, the herd breaking up as they entangled themselves in nets, were caught by concerned elders, or harvester crews still keeping their sanity caught and scolded missing members. Phil saw some get grabbed bloodied, or with their fur and skin visibly turning off color from something. "Something's wrong with them. Don't let them rip your gear," Phil shouted to one as he went by. He got a nod, saw a Lufthansa slapping another upside the head as they blatantly tried to tease open the first's hazard wrap with a pick. "Envoys are here," Stell announced, measured and cool. It was exactly what Phil needed to hear. All he needed was that brief slip in attention to miss the harvester being piloted towards him, ramming into him as a legion of lagomorph aliens on top of it cheered. Phil was pretty sure he heard one pop a sparkler or fire a gun or clink a drink in celebration. He landed hard at the far bottom of the tower. Something yellow-black swam in his vision that he wasn't sure was real or not. He blacked out. Phil woke in a bed that wasn't anywhere on the stellar flare. That was a little too small for him and felt more like a nest. The diplomat was next to him, curled up against him. She wasn't wearing anything. Phil had a brief, strange thought. Then he saw something crawling under her skin and over it. It was like she was covered in police tape, black-yellow, but not holographic. It was a wrapping that went more than skin deep, a warning and an omen all at once. Phil looked around. He was in a burrow house. He couldn't see any windows, so it must have been deep. He vaguely remembered hearing that the deeper the house went for a Lufthansa, the wealthier they were. A holdover from old behaviors, when deeper meant safer from whatever crawled and lumbered on the surface. He didn't feel very safe right now. Something grabbed him. Not physically, externally, but in his consciousness. It sounded like the diplomat, but she was obviously not awake. "Your thoughts are buried deep." Phil briefly struggled to figure out how to respond. "No, be silent. You are human. You are not attuned. You failed to attune." The voice listed off facts in Phil's head. "There are more of you?" Phil took that as a cue to speak. "What are you?" "Yellow." Phil didn't know how to respond to that. "Do you value this?" Phil watched, a frown slowly forming on his face as he tried to keep composure, as Yellow moved the diplomat's limb without waking her or even disturbing her. "I just met her." "Then it can stop moving. Human would not mind." "Is it trying to threaten me?" "Her? I'd mind. I'd very much mind." "Then forget. And we wait. We don't need this." "I don't understand. You can't. Agree? What happens if I don't?" "It can stop moving." Phil had no idea what was going on. He didn't know what this meant, if it was real, or if he was going insane in a hole somewhere after taking a really bad knock to the head. How had this thing avoided detection? Did it just use the diplomat's body to drag him somewhere? A lot of depressingly simple answers were the right ones, Phil found. He was formulating one already. He was IIC. He was semi-defunct and had barely had to earn his job in spite of it. But he'd not wanted it because he'd been told to take it. He'd wanted it because he thought of people worse off than just being a little weird-headed, and he liked the idea of things getting better for them, so he agreed. Phil sat on the bed in his personal quarters in the stellar flare. It had been a day and a half. The thought storm had gotten worse, much worse when nobody'd really expected it to. Drove everyone into a frenzy despite the has gear. It reminded Phil what he was actually here to do. He wasn't here to earn medals or prove himself, though. He'd done the latter by miles today, according to Stell. He was here to expect the unexpected and help fix things when that somehow inevitably got worse. He'd put in a particular request. It wasn't necessary, since it was already a pointed matter of concern, but he wanted some investigative legwork put into figuring out the muscle tissue and skin damage the Lufthansa participants had unexpectedly suffered. Memory loss was present, in some of them too. The wounds were all healing over already, or already healed, faster than was possible without proper medical tech, even for a paradise world species. No doctor had needed to touch them more than once. Someone messaged him on his datapad, which sat at his side on the bed. He used his mental adapter to ping it so it'd play it audibly. He had that egg he'd picked up in his hands, the only one he hadn't tossed. He started opening it with a simple cutting tool. As he did so, the message played, and he spoke. To Stell over the ship-wide segmented private channel network. You did well today, Stell reiterated. Why were some of them going after me? The ones that looked fine. When Phil focused, played the scene over in his head, some had just seemed generally crazy, not possessed. They don't have a fear of death. Naturally, anyway. Their self-preservation instinct is tied to achievement. There is a euthanasia program for... Never mind. The egg weave opened, revealing a piece of laminated documentation. Apparently, Phil now owned a significant estate that had fallen out of legal ownership after a civil dispute had gone on for too long. Specifically, the castle he'd seen outside, the tower. I guess I'm nobility for real now, huh? He laughed low and quick. It was a bit bitter. His face changed a little as he processed the message. Captain Philip Skyern. This is Liloza he Fathat. I don't believe I actually gave you my name. I'll be quick and to the point. I bet a lot of money on you. Nobody else thought you'd get any good prizes, so it seemed safe to bet on the confused human. Youngsters are always so judgmental. I didn't think you'd pick up a particular one, though. I'd like to formally request a trade. I did some digging on you, so this is a bit devious, but I gauge you're one who prefers subtler titles. Care to trade? My digging also revealed a bit about human social patterns. I offer this: humans like canines. I pulled one from an egg, or at least our closest equivalent to it. It hops and has floppy ears, and so do I. Pup? And a date for an old deed? Now he laughed again, but he couldn't manage to dig up any old wounds to go with it this time. Hardly. An appropriate thing to do so soon after first contact. But I suppose the IIC's mission does involve fostering all possible good relations. Stell broke in. Phil startled. I forgot you were... Doesn't matter. He'd barely been aware of his surroundings enough, for what felt like forever, to even think of things like that. He wasn't sure he was truly interested, but he needed the stimulation. His real prize was the nod he'd gotten from a crew member when he'd been picked up. During debriefing, it had been the only thing he could think of. A vision of holotape writhing over tender flesh flashed through his mind like a fading snapshot. Stell? Do we have access to the post-op med records from the incident down there? Yes, of course. Why? Keep backups of that for me. I can't tell you why. Just a hunch. Phil looked out the window, well reinforced against the vacuum of space and anything that could try to wander into his most private place while he slept. It felt like it wasn't enough, and he didn't know why. No lore note. Anyway, first, proper stellar flare crew story. Not sure if I did too much or too little here, but it is now a thing, and Phil is now a real character. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a big thumbs up and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.